Now, hold the presses. There's been a very important development in the national response to the pandemic today. This, in my view, is a watershed moment. It's only happened in one state so far, but it's bound to happen eventually across the nation. And the events in New South Wales today might just hurry it along a bit. What is this event? What has the new New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet announced today? Is it about kids going back to school and more people being allowed at funerals and weddings? Well, kind of. I'll come to those announcements in a moment. But the most important development today is that Dominic Perrottet has announced that the politicians are back in charge. He hasn't only announced it, he's demonstrated it. No longer will we see the Premier of New South Wales outsource the running of his state to unelected health bureaucrats, or see him hiding behind the mysterious, often cited but never seen medical advice. No, here is an elected official doing what we elected him to do, listening to the advice and then making the decisions, owning them and owning the accountability that comes from their implementation. It is terrific to see. We never should have seen government outsourced to bureaucrats. It always should be the elected officials who not only make the decisions, but take responsibility for them. But during this pandemic, we've seen governments head down this autocratic path in every state. It's an absurd and anti-democratic situation that's seen so-called health officials and police commissioners calling the shots under emergency powers. And they're still doing it a full 18 months and more since the pandemic began. Enough is enough. Dominic Perrottet and his cabinet have changed the pandemic roadmap in New South Wales. They held extended meetings yesterday, including with input from the Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chant. And when they announced them today, Dr Chant was not even there. Now, this is no slight against her. She's clearly been the best of the chief medical officers across the states. It's just a matter of getting the perspective right for good governance, the proportionality right. Perrottet says there will be no more so-called crisis cabinet, but rather a pandemic subcommittee of cabinet, which is where the Chief Health Officer will provide advice. There'll be no more daily briefings at 11 o'clock in the morning by the Premier and the health officials. Now, these changes are long overdue. This is a normalisation of a public health response, a normalisation of government and a normalisation of democracy. And the media pack today seemed to bristle a little at this change, wanting to know why the Chief Health Officer wasn't there.
Dr Chant is one of my favourite constituents from Epping, and we have a great relationship and always have. But as I made the announcement yesterday, we are moving away from 11 a.m. press conferences. The health numbers will now be provided.
But it is a health crisis, so the Chief Health Officer should be here.
Well, no? It's also an economic crisis as well. And as the new Premier, well, we're the elected officials, Chris. That is, and styles might be different and changes get made, but in my view, we had a very constructive discussion last night, and as the Health Minister has said, these changes are supported by the health team.
Yes, the elected officials, the bureaucrats, the Chief Health Officers, they're not elected. Nobody elected them. They don't face the accountability of the ballot box. It's the elected officials. They should make the decisions and they should be accountable for them. And the decisions announced today by Perrottet were a disappointment for some who were hoping that the opening up for the vaccinated in New South Wales, scheduled for this Monday, might have been brought forward to the weekend. That would have been a populist move, but what the Premier delivered was more substantial. He's doubled from 50 to 100 the number of people allowed at weddings and funerals from Monday, and says when the state hits 80% vaccination, probably just 2 weeks away, masks will no longer be mandatory in offices. But most importantly, he brought forward again the opening of schools. Year 1 and Year 12 students will be back in New South Wales Monday week, and all other years the week after that, on October the 25th, just over a fortnight away. As you know, I reckon they should be back in the classroom right now, but this means in 2 concessions over the past couple of weeks, The return of school in New South Wales has been brought forward by a full fortnight.
And I believe the changes we're making today are sensible, measured, and ensure we continue to open up in a safe way.
Yep, the new Premier is all about elected officials making the key decisions, and he's all about opening up. Compare that to the paranoid lockdown fetishists and the hard border enforcers in the other states.
We want to stay as COVID-free as we can for as long as we can while we get our vaccination levels up.
The federal government has to plan the booster shots. So then we've got to get everyone vaccinated, then we've got to get everyone a booster shot as well. Then we need a plan for the children. And then, of course, there is the hospital capacity issues, which are being dealt with at a national level as well. Realising that the hospitals will be under extreme pressure when the Delta outbreak happens.
Oh, and on it goes. In South Australia, they're sort of shifting the Christmas pageant and cancelling fun runs, even though they've got no COVID in their state yet. Look, left to their own devices, some of these premiers would never open up. Thankfully, Perrottet, like Gladys Berejiklian, perhaps even more so, is intent on pushing this country forward.